Hi everyone, it's Riley from Echidna Sewing here. Welcome back. Today I'm going to show you how to make your very own Christmas hat. You'll need your two fabrics. We recommend using a faux fur for the brim and the pom-pom, and a cotton. You'll need your sewing scissors, pins or clips, a washable pen. You'll need a needle and thread for hand stitching our pom-pom, our pattern. You can find this pattern on our website. You'll need a sewing machine. I'm using the Brother NV50S. I've got Resant thread in a grey colour and I'm using TNC's regular point needles. You'll also need a ruler. I'm using a patchwork ruler, but you can definitely use a regular one. Let's get into it. The first thing we'll need to do is to cut out our main hat piece. You'll need to cut this piece on the fold of your fabric. So I've got my fold down there. And you'll see it's marked on the pattern where you'll need to cut it on the fold. So I'm just lining that up there. And I'll pin that down. Now this pattern is for a regular 22-inch sized head. If you do need to make it smaller or larger, just take or add a couple of inches onto the end of this pattern. There is our main hat piece. Now we can cut out our brim and our pom-pom. So lay your faux fur right side down, grab your ruler. Now because I'm making mine to the standard size of 22 inches, I'm going to add an inch seam allowance onto the end of that. So I'm going to have 23 inches long, and then I'm going to make this 7 inches wide. If you have a bigger or smaller head, just measure your head size and add an inch for seam allowance. I'm just using my washable pen here to draw my measurements on, so it makes it easier for us to cut it. Then you can grab your pom-pom piece and just trace around with your washable pen. If you wanted to pin this down and cut it out that way, you could also do that. When you're cutting faux fur, it's better to use smaller snips rather than large cuts because that just reduces the amount of fluff you cut off. There is our brim piece all cut out. There is our pom-pom piece. Now I'm just going to cut off this excess faux fur here as I'm going to use it to stuff my pom-pom afterwards. Let's get into sewing. Start by flipping your main hat piece with right sides together. And you're going to pin or clip along this diagonal edge. Once you've done that, you can sew all the way down with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and a straight stitch, making sure you back tack at the start and at the end. Trim your excess threads and trim down this seam allowance. Turn that right side out. I like to use the tip of my scissors just to push that point out. You could also use a pencil or a chopstick. Your hat should look like that. Now we can move on to our brim. First things first is I'm just going to trim this fur down where our seam allowance is going to go, as it's going to make it a lot easier for us to sew the faux fur together. Now you can fold your brim in half widthways and pin or clip that edge together. Once you've done that, you can sew with a straight stitch and a 1/2 inch seam allowance. When you're sewing faux fur, it can be really slippery when it's under your presser foot, so it's best to just go slow to make sure you don't miss any of the fabric. And I'm just going to trim down this seam allowance now. Now we can fold this in half lengthways with our wrong sides facing together. Just like that. Now we can go ahead and base stitch around the top here. A base stitch is basically just a temporary stitch that holds fabric together while you're attaching it to something else. I'm going to make my stitch length as long as possible, and I'm just going to put my tension at about 5. And then just stitch with about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now we can attach our brim to our hat. So making sure your right side of your hat is facing out, just insert that hat through the middle of your brim, and we're going to align this seam up here with the seam on our hat. Just like that. Pin or clip that down. And do that for the rest of the hat. Once you've clipped that down, we're just going to sew a straight stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now make sure you put your machine back to your regular settings so you don't rebaste the edge again. Once I've sewn that, I'm just going to flip it right side out to check that all my seams have been sewn and I haven't missed any spots. Once I'm happy with that, I'm just going to go ahead and trim down this seam allowance. So now the final step is to just make our pom-pom. So I've got my needle and thread here, and I'm just going to sew a long running stitch around the outside of this pom-pom so that when I pull it nice and tight, it's going to gather up into a ball. So you want your stitches to be nice and close to the edge and rather large, just like that. Make sure you leave a tail on the end so we can pull it through. Once we're back to the beginning, we can just pull on either side of those thread tails, nice and gently, to gather that pom-pom up. Now before we pull it all the way, I'm just going to grab that excess faux fur from earlier, and I'm just going to stuff it inside. And pull your threads nice and tight. Once you're happy with how tight your pom-pom is, just go ahead and tie off those end threads. All right, and I'm just going to trim off this end that doesn't have the needle, as we're going to use this to stitch on the pom-pom to the end of our hat. All right, so I'm just going to put my needle through the end all the way down to the bottom of the pom-pom. And then I'm just going to stitch the end of the hat on. Doesn't need too many stitches, just enough to secure it down. Because you don't want your pom-pom falling off. Once I'm finished, I'm just going to tie off the ends. Right, and cut that off. There is your finished Christmas hat. Now, if you're interested in any of the products that you've seen in this video, please check out our website for more information, Also, don't forget to tag us on Instagram so we can see your creations too. Thanks for watching and happy sewing!